Hi, welcome. This is the presentation and also workshop on panels and how time moves through the panels and how we work with the reader's attention through the panels. So it's a workshop, so we're going to ask you to pick a panel from the selection of starter panels that are provided for you. Any panel will do. This comic, we're going to make a little comic at the end. It's going to be a little crazy. But that's okay. That's one of the experiments. Also, feel free to add text at any time. That is just another tool to play around with. So let's go. All right. So in general, the idea is that in comics, space equals time. So that means space on the page or space on the screen is sort of usually represents forward motion in time. Not always forward, but certainly time, usually time in some way. So here, from one panel to the other, we see one action, this sort of character kicking the other, and then the second character beginning to fall. Two actions. So it's moving just a tiny bit in time. It's focusing on the moments where something's happening, the kick and the beginning of the fall. Or maybe it is fallen completely and it's just sitting there on that log or something. So that period of time, that very small period of time, is represented by this space on the page, by these two panels taking up that space. Here's another example. This character, Mr. O, is about to smash this rock, holding it over his head. Bang, second panel, it's smashed. So there we go. One action, it's holding it up over his head. Second action, it clanging into two halves on the rock. So and here's more Mr. O. It's full of these kinds of examples. We're always looking at Mr. O. Mr. O is always doing something, and we're usually going from like the interesting action to interesting action, from the beginning of the shaking, for instance, to the really vigorous shaking here, or from seeing the bird flying, for instance, and lots of other examples. So we're always like going from one action to another. So let's try that. Do it now. Add one panel to any other panel. Actually, at this point, you've only got one. That moves the story a small amount in time, focusing on going from one action to the next. Keep the camera on the same subject. In Scott McCloud terms, he calls this action-to-action transition. So you're going to, from your panel, add another panel that moves forward in time, focusing on a different action. If your character isn't doing anything in panel 1, then maybe in panel 2 they're picking something up. If in panel 1 they were doing something like running or hitting something, then in panel 2 some sort of second part of that action or something would be the way to go. So let you pause that if you need to spend a little more time, and then we'll move on. So in this next way of controlling time, this next transition, it's really moving forward only moment by moment. That's a McCloud term also, moment-to-moment transition. The action and the subject are the same. And in fact, in this example, you might even say there's not much of an action at all. He's sleeping and he's still sleeping. Has his mouth moved a little bit? Not really sure. Pretty sure this example is by Salgood Sam, by the way. This is a better example from this Marvel comic. Time is slowed down so we can watch this bullet travel through time moment to moment. And the camera, we're going to use that term sometimes, even though it's not really a camera we're working with, but the camera zooms in a little. You can choose to do that or not, but the moment is really the utter slowness of time. We're just going from the split moment to split moment to split moment as this bullet moves closer and closer, farther and farther to the left. And we see the character's reaction changing from moment to moment to moment. Likewise, in this Calvin and Hobbes is leaping from the closet into Calvin, and we just get this really slowed down moment to moment view over 3 panels of how that's happening. So that's a pretty great example. So let's try that. Do it now. Add one panel to any other panel, so you can choose one or two, that moves the story only by a moment in time. The camera stays on the same action and subject. Little typo there. So like we said, McLeod calls this a moment-to-moment transition. So do that, and you can pause it if you need to, and we'll move on. So the next way we want to sort of look at the reader's attention is now we're going to move the camera around. Again, we're using that weird term. We're going to change where the reader's attention is by moving what they see. And still more than likely moving forward in time. So this duck, pig, whatever, shooting at Uncle Scrooge during a sled race. So we see the shooting, pow, and then we see the hit of the bullet breaks off Uncle Scrooge's sled handle, and we can imagine the next action would be Uncle Scrooge falling, but we're focusing on this one here, which is one character, one action, different character, different action. So the camera, again, is changing from one subject to another, and that's the McLeod term we'll use here, subject to subject. Here's some more examples from Gilbert Hernandez. Different subjects in just about every panel, except they're all focused externally on the same thing, which is this impending explosion. So here the woman is running with the two children. Here it's another set of the onlookers, another set of the onlookers. They're all worried about this explosion. Then the explosion happens. Now we've changed the subject. Again, we see the exploding rocks. Now, a little later, a few moments, maybe half a second, maybe a couple seconds, we see the final debris, the small rocks, going back to some of the onlookers, and then finally, from afar, the final results of this explosion, this giant cloud of smoke, this plume, and one of the other characters looking on. So that's 6 panels, all changing subject to subject, and moving forward in time as this explosion is impending, and then in the aftermath of the explosion. Here's a funny thing that happened once. I was pulling random Nancy cards, and I pulled 4 random cards, and they all happened to be subject to subject. And they told this really interesting story that you could just piece together. And the reason to look at something like this is because our minds are always trying to piece together a story. And that's one of the ways that we can work with the reader's attention. So I pulled this panel where Nancy is looking at Sluggo and this other girl, Irma, I think. Sluggo's got a little heart over his head. Now Nancy's thinking, right? These were random panels that we just sort of put together. But there's a strong connection because our minds put together a connection. What is she thinking about now that this is in her mind? What is she thinking about now? Panel 2. Panel 3 seems disconnected, but because we know that she was thinking about something, she must have been thinking about this. She must have been planning this, right? There's got to be some sort of connection. There's always a connection we're finding in our brains when we see images together, and that's what we're working with as creators. And in the 4th panel, she's in bed having this nightmare. Is it remorse having done something like that? I feel like that's what I get out of that. But again, it's random panels. When you put random panels together, your mind tries to stitch them together, and that's our job as creators, is to work with that attention that the reader gives, and the fact that their brain is going to stitch these stories together. So let's try this. Do it now. Add one panel that pushes the action of the story forward while changing the subject of the panel. I don't know what panel you pulled. I don't know what story is sort of unfolding in front of you, but now's the time to change the subject. Maybe another character suddenly appears, or maybe it is something that would have been affected by one of the previous actions that we just hadn't seen yet. There's a number of ways to play with this. Okay, now we're going to look at when the camera shifts around, but the action's mostly still. McLeod calls this aspect to aspect. You're looking at aspects of the same scene or the same mood, like in this 2-panel sort of grim shot of the castle, this grim shot of the villagers. There's no action happening here, right? But but it's just sort of setting the stage and the mood. Rick Geary played around with this a lot. You're just looking at different shots of these hotel rooms. So this is a simple one, but sometimes we forget about it. Let's try it. Add a panel to any of the other panels that we have that changes the subject, yet keeps the time relatively still. Easiest way to do that is just depict part of the room or part of the landscape. And it'll sort of serve to sort of establish mood and place and things like that. So try that. It's an aspect to aspect transition. Now, we're going to move on to significant movements in time between two panels. So here we see Tintin on his bed. He can't get himself off the hook. And then in the next panel, there is a firing squad getting ready to do him in. So the transition between here and there, probably hours. Is this evening and this is morning? I forget if this is evening. But anyway, it's significant enough that we would call it another scene. It's changed in time, it's changed in place. So we're calling it another scene. McLeod would call this a scene to scene transition. So let's do that. Let's add one panel to any of those other panels that moves the story hours ahead. But you're going to keep the camera on the same subject, whatever subject is in your story. And I know at this point, this story is getting weird, hard to control, a little bit out there. And again, that's fine. And in the postscript of this workshop, we're going to try and wrangle it in. So that's one variation on the scene-to-scene transition. Okay. Now, these are really significant movements in time. This is from a famous R. Crumb poster called A Brief History of America, and each transition is decades in time. From here with this rural landscape to this train going through. Suddenly, now there's a telegraph wire and some roads. Now there's more telegraph wires and more houses. Now there's lots of telephone wires, a railroad crossing sign. Now there's a sort of a city. Notice also the trees are becoming more bare here. There's only one tree left by panel 6. Now now we've got a big brick building here. And on it goes until about the 1970s or 80s. And every panel, there's decades between time. It's another way to control time. Easy to do once you realize it's an option. So let's try it. Add one panel to any other panel that moves the story in large amounts in months in time. So that could be months, years, or even eons, which of course is fun to do. So keep the camera on the same subject and move it forward months, years, or eons. That's our second scene-to-scene transition. Okay. Now, meanwhile, it's a change in scene and subject. And this is our third scene-to-scene transition type. Like a hawk, Robin plummets down in his quarry. It looks like I've got the drop on you. Meanwhile, the acro Batman trapezes through space. So it's a change in scene and subject. We're going across town. Or maybe even just across the scene a little bit, like in this one. Tintin hears, "Come on, let's go. The launch is waiting for us." And meanwhile, there's this conspiring going on in the Scottish pub. We've seen this a million times in most storytelling. So there's the machine to which we're entrusting our lives, sheer lunacy, etc., etc. Meanwhile, if there's no change of plan, it's just half an hour till departure. So we're watching two different parts of the story unfold in different places, sometimes at the same time, sometimes at slightly different times. But that meanwhile is the connector there. So for fun, let's try that. Add a meanwhile panel. That's our third sort of scene-to-scene type of transition. And we'll pause, and you can pause it and we'll go on. So one thing, now that we've sort of got a handle on time, we can start to play with the reader's attention a little bit more. We realize that every panel creates context for the next panel. On top of that, the accumulation of panels, the accumulation of story that we're in the middle of, that we're reading, that we're taking in, that creates context for the rest, for every panel that comes forward. So you can create an image like this, which doesn't inherently have an exact meaning. I've shown this to hundreds of students, and some people are like, well, he's holding his stomach, he's looking at his hand, he's looking at the empty chair and is really disgusted, or maybe he's really disgusted by what's on the chair, or maybe what's on the table, any number of things. We don't know. It's just a picture. But if I show you the first picture, the picture prior to that, the implication becomes a little more clear, although not entirely. There's this giant turkey or turkey, I guess, and his wide eyes, right? And then this panel, now it seems to be he's focusing on his stomach. So it seems like one of two things. He's either just finished eating that turkey, or he's noticing that he's hungry for the turkey. And again, it's the accumulation of story, both forwards and backwards, that'll help us understand what we're looking at. So sometimes we're playing with the reader's attention. Sometimes they may not know what one panel is until the next panel, and it's okay to play with that kind of thing. You want to keep the reader engaged with interesting drawings, interesting story, and questions about what it is they're seeing. In this entire context, we see the man comes in. It's actually quite simple. He sees this entire display of food, this banquet, looks at the turkey, gets his sort of hungry hand on his belly, and then takes off his coat and sits down to eat. It's a really simple sequence. But taking one panel out of context, or even two panels out of context, it needs the rest of that story in order for us to understand it. There it is. And so here's a great example from one of my favorite cartoonists, Leonie Braille. What is this panel? And even the lettering is like hard to read, right? But we can get with that. It says not too bad, right? This panel makes no sense whatsoever taken out of context. It's a series of lines and shapes and scribbly letters, but in its full context, it's actually really beautiful. It's this woman who is driving. I think she's driving on the other side of I think it's Australian car, so it's the other side of the highway from other side of the steering wheel's on the other side of the car from us. Anyway, and this man comes up on the outside asking to wash her windows. And so now we see it over a series of panels. He starts squirting onto her windshield. No thanks, she says. And then he says, it's okay, I got you anyway. And so now we're 3 panels into it, and he's starting to squeegee the window, and we see her there. And then, how was your day? Oh, it was okay, I guess. Work busy? Nah, not too bad. And so what's happening is it's just this like relationship is being created where there was resistance to it. And he's done, and she hands him a tiny bit of money. She says, you have the most beautiful freckles. And he says, thanks, you too, have a good one. And it's just this beautiful moment. Why there's an affinity sign after that, I don't know. But it's a great scene, whatever. But more importantly, that panel makes no sense whatsoever had you not been in sort of in the middle of the context already, right? There's no hand here. There's no fingers here. There's no silhouette of the character. She's not in the foreground. It's just a bunch of squiggles. But it's pretty effortlessly to read it when you're in the middle of the story. And that's another game we can play, another experiment we can try. So let's try it. Do it now. Add one panel to any other panel that would only make sense in the larger context. So out of context, it's too simple, it's too generic, it's possibly even too abstract to make sense. So in a sense, we're giving the reader no clues about that panel, but only in the larger sequence will they be able to put it together. that's good, at least for now. So give it a shot. Pause if you need to, and we'll move on. So you now have a strange but somewhat connected multi-panel story. In section 2, add some panels. Now you can have the freedom and hopefully the sort of tool set to sort of figure out how you can add some more panels to actually make this story make sense. I would say add 3 to 5 more panels to clarify the story. You could shift scenes. You can set up the scene earlier. You can clarify actions with more action-to-action sequences if you needed them. Feel free to use text. Sometimes text is this thing that really helps us. And sometimes a panel is all text. And that text might be a certain kind of transition. It might be, even in some ways, that might be an action-to-action transition or something like that. But use text to help you navigate the reader's attention through the story. Pay attention. How many panels do you need? What kind of transitions do you need? How does the story change with the addition of just a single panel? Where is the reader's attention? Another question about that is like, what are they understanding right now? How can you assist or even manipulate the reader's understanding of the story as they move through it? So have fun with this. You can take away a panel, by the way, of course. This is all about editing. And one reason this is a good exercise is because sometimes story ideas come up sloppily, right? They don't come up clearly. Sometimes we only get notions, and we sort of need to piece together some of the notions, and then with a sort of cooler eye, we can clarify it and help make it more articulate. So that's fun. As a postscript, this is very, very common knowledge now, but it's if you haven't heard of it, it's cool. It's called the Kuleshov effect. It was in early Russian cinema. Director experimented with this idea of shooting footage of a blank emotion on an actor. So a very neutral emotion like this, a neutral state, and then flashing some imagery after it. So a bowl of soup, and then the image after was the same image of the actor with the neutral expression, and asking viewers what they saw, and everybody says, "Oh, he looks really hungry for that soup." Likewise, they shot it with a deceased child in a coffin, and then everybody said, "Oh, wow, he looks really sad about that deceased child." And then in a third one, a very pretty lady on a couch or whatever, and then they looked at that same footage and they're like, "Wow, he's really interested in that woman." And the point being is that the image never changed. The image of the actor and his face never changed. It was the context that changed. And it was the context that created the story, and it created the meaning, and it created in the reader's mind what was going on. So that is what we're playing around with, is the creation of the story in the reader's mind. As a joke, I made this Nancy version, which is a bit of a cheat because Nancy is thinking and not really looking. But anyway, you can see that what it is she's thinking about changes depending upon what it was in the previous panel. But these are all scene-to-scene transitions, whereas the Kuleshov was subject-to-subject. Anyway, so that's the workshop. You now know a little bit more about controlling time in the panels. You know a little bit more about working with the reader's attention. So have fun, and I'll see you on the other side.